Don't worry.
Okay, well, good morning, bore da, croeso i'r cyfarfod plant a pobl ifanc yn Trefynwy. Good morning and welcome to Children and Young People Scrutiny Committee meeting on Teams this morning for MCC. I'm Tudor Thomas and I'm the chair of the committee, and I will obviously be chairing the committee today. I'm not going to go around and ask everybody to introduce themselves. It becomes quite complicated, but obviously when you speak, if you can say, you know, who you are and your responsibility, etc. at the start, then that would obviously help the public. A little bit of housekeeping. If you're actually presenting, I would ask you to both mute your microphone and also to your camera, so that I will be on and then the presenter. Okay, so that's the format that I'd like us to take today. I also made a point earlier on in the pre-meeting with representatives making statements or asking questions. I would ask that statements are relatively short, and also that when it comes to the asking of questions, a maximum of 2 questions at any one time. I think it's unmanageable when 4 or 5 questions are given to presenters or officers, and I think we lose the actual thread of the meeting. So if I could make that point. Obviously welcome. You can see 1 or 2 additional members here today. Obviously welcome them. Councillor Armand Watts from Chepstow is going to join us for the agenda item 6 on blended learning. And I've had a note from Lisa Dimmock saying that Councillor Lisa Dimmock, she will be joining us slightly later on. I have not had any full apologies for this committee meeting. So in terms of agenda item 1, apologies for absence, there are none that I am aware of. 2 declarations of interest. If we go as and when if there is an agenda item that you feel you have got an interest, then please declare that so that can be recorded. Item 3, the public open forum. I'm not aware of any member of the public wishing to make any statement or declaration today. So we swiftly go to 4, and I welcome Nicola Wellington, who is the officer responsible for the Children and Young People budget, and she's now going to take us through this item, which could be fairly lengthy, in terms of looking at the scrutiny of the budget, in terms of monitoring the capital and reserve positions at month 7, and then setting the context for the scrutiny of budget proposals for the coming years. So welcome, Nikki, and I hand over to you.
Thank you, Chair. I'm going to hand over very swiftly to Tyrone Stokes, who's going to take us through the first part of the report, and then I'll come in afterwards if that's okay.
Yeah, that's fine. Thank you.
Thanks, Nikki. Welcome, members. Hopefully you've got the report in front of you, and myself and my colleague Nicola Wellington are here to present the 2020-21 month 7 revenue and capital forecast outturn for the Children and Young People Select Portfolio. If I firstly refer you to the recommendations in section 2, and what I'd like to first of all is draw your attention to 2.1, which highlights the month 7 deficit for the revenue budget of 6.43 million, and points A and B showing its makeup. Point A being a £518,000 deficit for non-COVID related revenue budget, and the remaining 5.91 million relates to COVID-related pressures that we are exhibiting in our revenue budget. 2.7 then details capital, and that's the spend of 25.3 million and the associated use of slippage that's carried forward from the previous year of 37.4 million. Section 3 goes into details around some of the more salient key issues surrounding the month 7 revenue outturn. If I highlight section 3.10 to you, and that gives you a table for the overall council fund for the revenue position as at month 7, and that then comes back to the £6.43 million overspend I previously mentioned, and the split between COVID and non-COVID related expenditure. If I look to talk you through the area under my remit, which is the social care children's services element of the children and young people portfolio, children's services are forecasting an overspend of 1.46 million in its revenue budget, and the main reasons for these can be found under 3.16. The main reasons are the first 2 bullet points, and that's the increase in children looked after numbers since we set the budget. When we set the budget for this year, 2021, children looked after numbers stood at 197. At the start of this financial year, they increased to 220, and they've more or less been stable throughout the year. At month 7, the children looked after numbers were 222. Then we agreed a 2.75% pay award, and there's only 1% in the budget. So that gave an extra pressure of 1.75% that had to be funded through the children's services budget. And then some increased legal costs account for the £1.46 million overspend within children's services. In terms of capital for children's services, there are no capital schemes. And if you like, I'll take questions at the end, and I'll hand over to my colleague, Nicola Wellington, who can take you through the schools element of the budget. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Tyrone.
It's okay, no problem.
Many thanks. Thank you, Chair. So I'm just going to run through the children and young people's part of the budget. So to start off with, just to let you know that at month 7 we were £125,000 overspent. I'll run through the detail now of that overspend for you. So in terms of recoupment income, this is income that's received for children with additional learning needs that are educated within our local authority. So there is an increase of that income to Monmouthshire County Council of £241,000. This is all on page 7 of Appendix 1, just so members can follow under standards. The result of the increase in income is due to 2 things. One is the number of pupils that are being educated within Monmouthshire from other authorities, and we put an increase in the price at the beginning of the year to ensure that we were recovering the costs of the support that were put in for those children. The second element is children placed in our independence provision, which is 115,000 over. And again, that is a result of part of that is a result of the 3 boys that were at Mountain House when Mountain House closed, and obviously they moved into independent provision, and that has increased the cost for the independence. But obviously we've seen a saving through Mountain House. The other element is pupils placed in other local authorities, which is 130,000 over, and again that's a combination of the number of pupils that are accessing that provision and the cost of those placements. The biggest by far is the support that we provide for our pupils to remain within the county, and that's 495,000 over. Part of that, 200,000 of that, relates to 2 of the local schools in Monmouth. One is Monmouth Comp and one is over Mono. members will be aware that they have special needs resource spaces at those schools, and the placement of pupils in there, we've increased the numbers of pupils that can access that provision, and therefore obviously increase the support that we provide for those schools. So each of those schools have received 100,000 each to support pupils. Just running through the rest of the over and under spends, the material ones. Given the current pandemic, a number of children, what we call our rising threes, so children accessing nursery provision in our schools. Obviously, given the pandemic, a lot of rising threes did not enter into the education system at the time into our nurseries due to the closure of schools over the summer term, and therefore we saw 150,000 saving on placement costs that we would have been providing for nurseries in our schools. And finally, breakfast clubs similarly have obviously faced a turbulent time over the last 6 months in terms of the pandemic. Having opened in September, the numbers were low, understandably low, and the income has resulted in an 88,000 less income coming into the local authority. Just to wrap up there really on Central, so obviously ALN is our main area of concern. It still remains a concern with us, but you know, it's pleasing to note that we're able to meet those costs to ensure that we can keep those children within county. I'm happy to take any questions now, or would you like me to move on to schools next, Chair?
I think shall we move on to schools, and then we'll take all the questions, obviously starting with Tyrone and Children's Services, and then move on to schools and CYP.
Chair, could I just ask if Nicola could state which page on the finance report she's referring to, because it's difficult to follow it. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Brown.
Yes, certainly. It was on the Appendix 1 of the report, and it's page 7 in the table headed standards.
Sorry, in ours we've just got like page 50 or page about the appendix is about page 50 on our.
Okay, let me find it on the
thank you
on the main report then for you. Let's just have a look.
It just makes it easier to follow.
Yeah, yeah, that's absolutely fine.
I must admit, I've picked it up on the sort of public way, you know, public publishing of the agenda.
Yeah, so on the main report, obviously I was referring to children and young people, which is on page 4, which is the 125,000, but the detail is actually provided in the appendix. So Appendix 1, revenue capital monitoring forecast. That's on the second link down.
Yeah, I'm looking at the member report, so maybe I'm better to look at the public one. Thank you.
Yeah, I'd advise that, because it does give page numbers as well. Okay.
Okay. All right. Okay.
If you carry on, please.
Yeah, certainly, no problem. So just going back then now. So again, in Appendix 1, and this is on page 17. And I'm going back on to sorry, it's on, yes, on page bottom of page 17, start of page 18. So this is the schools position then. So the schools are in a collective deficit of 422,000. At the start of the year, we had 17 schools in a deficit, and we now have 13 schools in a deficit, so a slight improvement there. I just wanted to go through some of the major savings really that schools have been able to do. So in terms of our 4 secondary schools, they pay to Modern Life for the use of leisure centres. It's between 60 and £70,000 per school per year. Now, obviously, with Monlife, with the leisure centres and the schools being closed over the summer term, Monlife and schools are not using the leisure centres currently, then that charge will not be made to the schools, and Monlife will recruit those costs via the COVID fund. So there'll be, in terms of Monmouthshire, there'll be no loss because we can do it through the hardship fund, but fortunately schools will not need to make those costs. That's similarly with our primary schools, but on a much smaller scale in terms of swimming lessons. Then again, obviously they are not, the swimming lessons are not taking place, and therefore the costs of those swimming lessons schools will not need to bear. In terms of the schools, in table 2.4, that will give you the schools that are in a deficit position, and it's lists the 13 at month 7. Just to remind members that King Henry have obviously taken out the loan that was on offer to schools of 250,000, which has seen them come into a surplus position. The only other things that I wanted just to raise is just to give you some ideas of the COVID costs that schools are actually claiming for at the moment. So in terms of staffing, it's around £55,000 per month that they're claiming from the hardship fund. Those costs relate to a number of reasons: school staff that are shielding, staff that are awaiting results of COVID tests, staff that have been in contact, etc. But also members will be aware that any staff that are pregnant over the 28 weeks are unable to work within the school. They can obviously work from home, but schools do need cover. So with that's part of the claim as well that we're making. I'm happy to take any questions now, Chair.
Okay, thank you, Nikki. Thanks for that. Shall we start with Children's Services with Tyrone to sort of look at that, and then come to Nikki? Okay, Tyrone. Any questions from members now regarding the Children's Services budget? I think, Martin, you were going to raise, Councillor Martin Grocott, please.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning. Thanks for the update. I should imagine keeping budgets in order at the moment must be an absolute nightmare. One thing I was interested in is the cost of children in independent and out-county provision. And clearly in the last 12 months through the closure of Mountain House, that's come to the forefront. But generally, once that bubble, if you like, is out of the way, I would hope that we are working closely with colleagues in health and in children's services, so that we know almost from birth many of the children who are likely to have very severe additional learning needs, who might need to go into out-county provision. And we're not ever going to be able to afford to meet some of those desperate needs ourselves because they're so rare and they're so specialist. I wonder if you could reassure me that we are working with colleagues, that we're looking down the road and that we're able to build into our budgets costs in years ahead for independent and out-of-county provision. Thanks.
Nikki or Tyrone, do you want to take that?
Yeah, I'm happy to take that, if that's okay, Chair. Yeah, sorry. In terms of education, I'm sure that Ty will come in afterwards from a social services point of view. In terms of education, yes, we are. We're very well aware of the costs that are coming through, and we've actually seen an improvement over the last few years in terms of forecasting those costs that are coming through. What we have put in place in very, very recent months now is a tracker that we've got, which will actually track the pupils right from the very start of their education process, and we'll be able to track the costs of those pupils as they move through their education, and track their placements and where their path of education will be. So yeah, that's in place now, and that will certainly give us a lot more clarity around the costs going forward for all of our pupils.
Okay, thanks. Tyrone, did you want to make a comment?
Yes, please. In terms of what Councillor Grocott raised, I can assure the councillor that we work extremely closely with our health and education CYP colleagues, as Nikki has briefly highlighted. When a child is presented to the local authority, we have a multi-agency approach. We deal with health, so their health issues are dealt with and the appropriate funding, or we try and secure the appropriate funding. Similarly with education as well. And if they need higher education support, again, then we can tap into the relevant body there. In terms of what Nikki was saying about a tracking in CYP, in terms of social care children's services, we've had a tracking in place now for the past 7 to 8 years, tracking children. And if I just remind members that I brought a paper to CYP Select a few years ago around the range of unit costs for a child looked after, and on average is about £45,000 a year. But it is a big variation. If children are within foster care, the unit cost is about £28,000–30,000 a year. If they're in out the county residential placement, that could be as much as £300,000–500,000 a year. In terms of where children's services are now, they are in a very good place. We've boasted over the years our intervention and prevention services, our front of house services. And at the moment, as I briefly mentioned when I did my presentation, children looked after numbers are stabilising around the 220, 222 numbers. What I can't reassure Councillor Grocott or other members is how those numbers will now fluctuate moving forward as we start to come out of that pandemic. Sometimes we don't know what we don't know. And also around the court intervention as well, and direction the courts give us in terms of a child looked after as well. But one thing I can say about the service, even though I can be a critic of the service, they have done a fantastic job over the past 3 to 4 years, especially, as I mentioned, the amount of prevention and intervention services that are now in place, stuff like Achieving Care Together, Building Stronger Families Connections. And also another paper that went to members a few years ago is around the setting up of our MIST team, which is the multi-support team that can look at more in-house and also community-based services on offer, rather than having to put children looked after into expensive out-of-county placements. Thanks.
Okay, thanks. Councillor Joe Watkins.
Thank you very much. Actually, I think Tyrone has probably actually answered most of that, because my question was going to be, even with the pressures on the children's services budgets, are we still really heavily investing into our prevention services and supporting family services? But I think you've just said all of that, so thank you very much. So it's good to hear that those services are working, and also reassuring that the levels have stabilised this year, although also from my work in the food bank, I'm not at all sure whether we're going to keep stable numbers as the effects of the pandemic hit home further down the line. So thank you.
Okay.
Can I just add to that,
yes,
Chair? I totally agree with what Councillor Watkins mentioned, and that's the difficulty now. So as we start moving out, we can't be complacent and the numbers are stabilising, because we don't know what we don't know. But just to reconfirm, we are still heavily investing in the preventative intervention services. And as you'll see in the next agenda item, in setting next year's budget, we are looking to address as a council the kind of in-year deficit for children's services. So we are continuing that investment as well. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Tyrone. Any other questions from councillors? Councillor Louise Brown.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to ask the question. I mean, it seems like, you know, a large proportion of the current overspend on the revenue side is hopefully coming back in relation to COVID-related expenditure. And I just wondered, could you give me the overall figure of what in month 7, what the overall deficit on revenue is, and how much of that deficit is related to children and young people's budget?
Okay, thanks.
I can do the overall council one, and then I've got my colleague Jonathan Davis, who might be able to kick in, just in case I get something wrong. He can step in really quickly just to stop me making a fool of myself if I am getting things wrong. But if I just refer you back to my earlier setting up the presentation, I drew your attention to the recommendation in point 2.1. And if I refer you back to that, it stated that the month end deficit was an overspend of 6.43 million for the council revenue fund, of which 5.91 million related to COVID. So I think that might answer your question, Councillor Brown. In terms of CYP, I can just take the children's services element, and none of that relates to COVID. Any COVID-related pressures for children's services has been fully recovered through the hardship fund. The overspend in children's services is 1.46 million, and that relates to those costs that we would have had anyway if we weren't in this pandemic, and that's relating back to what I mentioned is the increase in children looked after numbers since we set the budget, the in-year increased pay award, and the legal costs. I hope that does answer for you, Councillor Brown. I think Nikki would possibly add around the other CYP elements, and if I've got anything wrong, I'm sure my colleague John Davis will come in and just correct anything.
Sorry, could I just clarify? So
Yeah, sure,
basically, it's sort of if we get the COVID-related expenditure back, then I think the deficit is about 4.13 million. Is that right? Is that the? I mean, really, what I'm trying to establish is what the current deficit gap is in revenue, and what the contribution is in terms of the deficit for CYP. And I'm not really quite clear on what that is. I think it seems like there's a gap of about 4 million if we get all of the expenditure back. But and I think you said, was it 1.6 million or 1.4 million that was attributed to CYP? Is that right?
The 1.4
in terms of overspend.
Sorry.
Yeah. Can you let Tyrone answer now, please?
Sorry, Councillor Brown. I didn't mean to unmute my mic and just cut you slightly short there. In terms of the children's element within social care, it is an overspend of 1.46 million, and that would have been there irrelevant of COVID, and that's something we've got as a pressure when we come into the next item in setting next year's budget.
Yeah.
In terms of the overall position and one of the remaining CYP, I'll hand over to Nikki to do the CYP, and then hopefully John Davis can come in and just clear up the overall aspect for the authority for Councillor Brown.
Was most of that related to an increase in looked after children as opposed to the schools side?
The 1.46 million for the overspend in year that relates to children's services, social care, the majority is due to the increase in the children looked after numbers. Yeah. The increase in children looked after numbers accounted for just over £1.1 million of that 1.46 million overspend.
Oh, so a lot then, yeah.
900,000, 260,000 related to overspend in legal, and the rest related to the increased pay award.
All right. Okay.
All right. Thank you. That's more understandable. Thank you.
Okay.
It's okay. Yeah. Sorry, I got it in the end. Sorry for going around the houses on that one.
Nikki, do you want to come in at all on this, or are we fairly clear now?
Well, just to add that CYP is 125 over, so that's the CYP element that needed to be added on to Tyrone's element for this select committee.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Grogot, did you have your hand up?
Thank you, Chair. This is, I guess, probably in Tyrone's area, but I noticed we've got the senior officer responsible for children's services here as well. So maybe Julie Boothroyd might want to comment. In Appendix 3, I note the cost of agency staff in children's services. And it seems to me that every year since I joined the council, we have said that we are not recruiting enough of our own staff and social workers. Clearly, there is a financial benefit in having our own staff rather than employing agency staff. But I would have thought there was a human benefit in terms of the relationship with our children from having our own social workers and staff generally. And I wonder if there's any chance that the cost of agency staff might be reduced, if not got rid of, within the next year. Thanks.
Tyrone, would you like to come in on that?
Yeah, if I start first, and then as Councillor Grolcott's pointed, Julie's logged in as well, so Julie might wish to add. In terms of the agency staffing, we have got the increase in the children looked after numbers that I mentioned. When we set the budget, it was 197, and then within a month or two, it then increased to around 218. So we had an almost 30 increase in children looked after number within a short space of time. That then does an impact on all of the other support services, for example, legal, transportation, and also staffing as well. And especially within the pandemic as well, sometimes we have to go to agency staffing just to tide us over while we are trying to recruit around that, and also to deal with all of those issues as well with a sharp increase in children looked after numbers. But we have got a workforce plan. We have got a workforce group that does look at this on a regular and ongoing basis to see where we can recruit in a house, that we do try and maximise that opportunity.
Okay, thank you, Tyrone. Any other questions from members of the committee before I bring in? I've got a hand up from somebody who's just joining us this morning, Councillor Armand Watts. Councillor Armand Watts, would you like to come in with your question or comment?
Yes, Chair. Hi, good morning, everybody. Thank you for letting me come in. I just wanted to nip in on this one because, you know, for many years I was on this committee, and obviously now I'm not. And it's really interesting to hear some of the questions again, because they're the same questions. Some of them are similar to what I can remember that were being fired at the local authority by elected members probably 10 years ago. But it's specifically on this. It's about consistency within social services. So this is a question really for Julie. Obviously, I don't want to labour Martin's point, but obviously there is a greater benefit to having that consistency of staff. What proportion over the 12-month have you had of the workforce that have effectively been agency staff within the authority, and how is that being? You know, that what I guess where I'm going with this is the length of contract. What is the commitment when you employ a member? I can't remember the reason I'm asking is I'm sure I've had the answer before, but the length of contract then that you would facilitate for an agency staff worker. Is it 3 months? Is it 6 months? Is it 12 months? And what are the overall on average per employee? What is the difference between employing one of our own members of staff to then employing an agency staff member? Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you. Tyrone, do you want to come back on that? Oh, sorry, Julie.
Yeah, sorry, I was going to come in if that's okay. Thank you, Chair.
By all means.
Yeah, thanks for those questions. I'll just go back to the issue about agency staff particularly, and interestingly, Councillor Watts, you know, I've sat in this place for a long time too, and obviously from a children's service perspective, I'd go back a few years where our percentage of agency staff was much, much higher. It is no longer in that high place. And I think one of the things I would want to make sure that people are aware of is that there will always be a requirement at some level for there to be some agency cover. And so I think within the whole mix of what we're doing, we're in a very, very different place to where we were perhaps 4 or 5 years ago. I'll have to defer to Ty for the numbers because I haven't got them off the top of, I think I have, but I'm not exactly sure I've got the right numbers in my head. But Ty also referred to the weekly workforce meeting that goes on, and there is a very active plan that actually reviews and monitors the agency uptake, the requirement for agency, and also the, if you like, the discharge of agency. I think one of the features that I would want members to be aware of is that the staffing complement in children's services is probably more stable than it has been in the last decade. We are attracting quality people who want to work in Monmouthshire and who are staying in Monmouthshire. But there are times, and we're in one of those times this year, where we've had some sickness issues and we've had some issues where people have left, and actually being able to get somebody in of the right quality can take some time. So we have been running agency on longer contracts. So to answer your point, Councillor Watts, there isn't a designated sort of level. It's very much about the service and operational need at a particular time. But what has been quite interesting is that we've been able to convert quite a high proportion of our agency staff into our staff. And I think that very much speaks to the consistency issue, and actually being able to keep those staff in our service has been a real positive. But I would accept that when we are having agency staff, there can be disruption, but we're trying to mitigate that all the time. And, you know, like I said, the conversion rate has been quite good as well. But our plan is to have our own workforce. That is exactly the plan that we want. But I wouldn't want members to think that there would never, ever not be agency cover, because there always will be. But it's making sure it's at the right proportion and for the right reason. I hope that answers a couple of the questions.
Well, Chair, if I may, I wasn't quite sure the answer I got there, and I don't know. Forgive me, Julie, if Tyron's just about to chip in and answer the questions. So obviously, it was about the financial impact, but also the numbers. What proportion, again, of our staff are actually employed through agency?
Looking at numbers, I've just tried to scrabble around while Julie bought me a bit of time that I could look at the numbers. Currently, we're tracking at around 6 agency staff, which is one of the lowest levels that we've had for a while.
But how many, Tyron? How many staff members have we got? How many is 6 into that? What's the percentage?
6 into it is roughly by my count around 8% of the workforce.
Thank you.
When we started the year, it was around 12 to 13 agency members that we've had. So as Julie mentioned, what we've done this year, even though we've been in a pandemic, we've had an increase, a sharp increase before the start of the year in children looked after numbers. We've managed to reduce our agency usage by half and convert them over as well. But like Julie says, there will always be some sort of buffer, for the want of a better word, that we would need. But it does show that we are actively pursuing where we can to try and remove from those agency contracts. And even though Julie did mention that sometimes they are longer, with agency staffing, we don't commit. We don't say you're on agency for 2 years. We have got that ability where we can do it month by month.
Okay.
I hope that answers your question.
Well, no. So what I guess what I was looking for. Sorry, I really do apologise, Jay, but it was really to press you on the financial impact of that. What does that really mean? You know, what's the difference? I asked the question, Tyron, was what's the difference between employing? You know, I've asked similar questions before when it came to foster care, when we've employed agency foster carers. I know that's an old issue, really, but what is the difference between employing a member from an agency to the local authority compared to then obviously either growing our own, which I'm sure that's the ultimate goal really of what Julie wants to do, like any good manager, or bringing in you know, staff from outside from an agency? What's the financial difference there?
Okay.
To answer that is not as straightforward as that, because what we've got the gift we can do, we can always flex the hours that agency staff work where we can. So for example, if we've got a full-time 37-hour vacancy, we may be able to flex agency to maybe accommodate with the budget we've got. But overall, the impact this year is around in the region of 2 to 250,000, but we have managed to negotiate with Welsh Government to try and get some of that expenditure through the hardship fund, where it does relate to increased pressure
Okay, I think we've sort of exhausted that. We'll move on now then. And thanks, Councillor Watts, and thanks, Tyrone, and Julie Boothroyd for answering those questions. Councillor Martin Croker, you've got a hand up.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, third question from me. This is again on Appendix 3. It refers there to a slippage of nearly £12,500 in the Tranche B 21st Century Schools initiative in Abergavenny. And if we're slipping before we've even put a spade in the ground, I'm a little concerned. Can I have reassurance that that project is on track and on time?
Thank you, Chair. I'm happy to answer that question.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, I mean, obviously there has been delays in the projects in terms of the current situation. I can assure members now that the project is. We've appointed the project managers. We've appointed the architects. So the project is moving forward now. So yeah, I can assure you that we're working to the 2024 opening date for that new school, and everything is on track for that at the moment.
Okay, thanks, Nikki. Thanks for that. Any other questions before we come to the end of this item? No. Well, first and foremost, obviously thank Tyrone Stokes and Nicola Wellington for taking us through quite detailed documents. Obviously, we had a chance to look at them beforehand. In terms of children's services, obviously Tyrone's outlined some of the difficulties and obviously the increase in looked after children rising from in 2019 from something like the low sort of 200s to 190 odd to 220, and obviously that has had a significant effect in terms of the budget. Yeah, 197 children moving up to this January 220, and obviously that's got a cost implication. Obviously, an increase in legal fees linked to those cases, and also obviously the pay increase for staff within children's services. We've obviously had some quite detailed questions from Councillor Brown about the budget and where the areas that are related to COVID are not related to COVID, and that is obviously important. And also now latterly the questions that Councillor Grocott and Councillor Armand Watts raised about the use of agency staff, and obviously that has got a major cost implication and obviously a human cost, and that's something that obviously we would want to see kept as much as possible to a minimum. In terms of the CYP budget, Nikki obviously took us through that, and we've had questions there about it. It's pleasing to see that there are less schools now in deficit. It is still a bit concerning to see that there are 3 comprehensives that are still in deficit, and obviously King Henry's come out by taking a loan. Obviously some benefits in terms of not having to pay the leisure centres, and that's obviously helped the budget. Overall we seem in terms of CYP now to be in a stronger position moving forward, and there are no major cuts implied in the coming year. And I know after this year, then obviously that is a major plus for people within the school system. Pleasing to hear as well that the King Henry Ban B now with the new 3 to 19 school that is moving forward, and that has picked up, and obviously people in Abergavenny, parents in Abergavenny will obviously be looking very much forward to that development happening. But thanks both for your inputs. Diolch yn fawr. Thank you. We'll now move on to item 5 on the agenda, and we're going to look at the budget scrutiny, and it's the scrutiny of the overall budget proposal. I believe Peter Davis is going to take us through this.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Do you want me to take over the reins now from this point? I've got a presentation that I've prepared, which I think and hopefully will provide obviously a rounded context and understanding of the budget proposals, both the draft revenue and capital proposals. And as per the original item, we've got Tyrone and Nikki on the call as well, who will be able to ably respond me, and obviously you in questions that come to the fore at the back end. But given obviously the depth of the draft budget proposals, it's very much the reason that I've put the slide deck together. So if it's okay with you, Chair, I'll put the presentation up on screen and start my way through it. But unless there's anything further you want to add, Chair.
No, I just remiss of me really. I should have introduced you, Peter, as the Chief Finance Officer for MCC, and obviously Peter now will take us through the slide deck and obviously answer questions at the end. So I'll hand over to you, Peter. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Okay, so just give me just 1 moment just to bring the slide deck up onto the screen.
If you've got your hand up, could I ask people to put them down from the previous session?
Okay, can I just check with you, Chair, that
yes, that's come up.
It's up here. Okay, excellent. Okay, well, thank you, Chair. Thank you all for receiving me today. And as the Chair just alluded to, so yes, I'm the what's called the Section 151 officer of the Council, as well, you know. So responsibilities for matters of public purse and finance, and that's part of my wider remit and role as Chief Officer for Resources. So we're looking to use a very similar slide deck to the one that we're going to be soon to be rolling out for the budget consultation that we're separately doing over the next 4 weeks with the public. But I'll talk to that now later on. So. Obviously, first off, just a welcome to everybody, and just to provide some sort of high-level context. You know, this conversation is around scrutiny of the draft budget proposals for next year, and worthwhile and timely, I guess, just coming off the back of the report that you will have just scrutinised, the Month 7 report. So I don't need to really touch on too much some of the challenges that the council's currently facing, because I think you'll be pretty conversant with that through what you've just debated. But suffice to say, you know, the council has continued to have to bring forward significant levels of savings in recent years, 22 million over the last 4 years, and I guess this year is an unusual year. I think we can probably all say that in terms of what we're having to face, both in terms of the pandemic, I guess our public service response to the pandemic, particularly as a council, and coming off the back of obviously a number of challenging events, which also included you know, some severe flooding early part of last year, which is all told put the council's finances under a huge amount of strain, you know, and that's notwithstanding, and as it says on the slide there, you know, ongoing demand pressures on the council, and certainly in the proposals for next year, you know, we've got over £10 million of pressures that we're having to accommodate. But the budget strategy for next year is, I guess, somewhat different to what I guess members might have seen in the last few years, and that's because of the fact that we've got to be very careful here that whilst on the one hand, and it's not a contradiction, but whilst on the one hand the council's finances are under a huge strain, we equally need to recognise the importance of, you know, the service offer that the council has. We also need to recognise the pressures that is on those services at the moment, the capacity of the organisation, not just the money and the finances of the organisation, is hugely stretched. So the budget proposals for next year have been a very tricky balance, really, but they have to be thoughtful in the same respect. So, you know, it's commonly brandished the fact that we are the worst funded council in Wales. That is in fact still the case, but we have at least received an above average settlement from Welsh Government. And it has allowed us, in the way that we've constructed the budget strategy for next year, to continue to support those priorities of the council, and which sit alongside, and I'm sure that all members of the committee will be aware of the COVID, the winter plan, the COVID plan that we have running alongside the corporate plan, and which drives our focus as an organisation at this time. So, as I said, truly unprecedented year. A lot more cost, that £10 million of pressure that we're having to accommodate, and still, despite that, a continued need to invest in the future. You know, we still need to continue to reshape and redesign services as we move forward. But I guess the nub of the issue is one whereby, whilst we've got an above average settlement from Welsh Government, that still is insufficient to cover you know, the significant pressures that we're having to accommodate into the budget. And given that sort of thoughtful approach, that careful balance, we are going to have to, we are proposing to make one-off use of reserves. That is not you know, something that we would do ordinarily, but it is certainly something that we feel is necessary. And that again is to allow us to obviously sustain services and obviously not see them fall away, because we know that, you know, if they fall away, it's very difficult to bring them back. Wait a second, Chair. I guess within that very tricky balance, and I guess it's obviously matters that you know, Cabinet are having to preside over, and you know, the increase in council tax proposed for next year is 4.95%. I know we've got Phil Murphy, the Cabinet member for Resources, on the call today, and I won't bring him in at this point, but certainly he may wish to comment and feature in any response to questions after I finish. But that is something that Cabinet are proposing at this time. And the reality is, and as I've said, that very careful balance, we don't have, you know, a ready list of other viable options. You know, our reserve funding is at very low levels, certainly in comparison to other local authorities in Wales. And so from a treasurer perspective, I've had to very carefully make use of those balances. As I said, they're very limited, but I have had to inject reserve funding and capital receipts both into the current year, in terms of what you've just seen with month 7, and into next year. But that is not a sustainable long-term solution. It is a bit of a needs-must situation. So you can just see on the slide there what that works out at, just in terms of the impact of a 4.95% increase on the sort of the usual sort of barometer, the Band D equivalent. That translates into a £1.31 a week increase. And again, if you look at how I guess our Band D equivalent compares with other councils in Wales, we're actually somewhere in the middle of the pack there. You see us just to right of centre, and just slightly above the All Wales average, as is referred to at the bottom of the slide. It's worthwhile just familiarising members just in terms of the makeup, and we always do this comparison to show the two ends of the extreme very much in terms of Monmouthshire and Blaenau Gwent. So what you'll see there is Monmouthshire, just in terms of the you know, the chargeable dwellings for council tax and how that spreads itself across from Band A to Band I. And similarly then, if you take Blaenau Gwent at the other end of the spectrum, where you'll see it massively skewed to the left. They have very few properties, you know, in terms of the council tax income generating properties, you know, up in those band E to I range, and therefore, you know, it just shows the distortion, and in fact where Monmouthshire is left really in terms of the significant level of council tax that it has to raise as a proportion of Welsh Government funding. In terms of the settlement from Welsh Government, so we received a provisional settlement from Welsh Government on the 22nd of December, very late, but obviously expected, because it came again off the spending review that the Chancellor announced just a matter of weeks prior to that. We have had an above average increase, which in my time in Monmouthshire is slightly unheard of. And very much welcome, certainly from my perspective as a treasurer. You know, we sit above the All Wales average, 3.9% increase, and that has actually helped as we've put the final pieces of the jigsaw together on the budget proposals, because that actually sat ahead of what our modelling assumptions were showing. You know, and that is the second year as well that we have actually seen you know, a positive increase in the settlement. But again, as I said earlier, it doesn't offset and cover all of our pressures. We still remain the worst funded council per head in Wales. And there are some residual risks and uncertainties that we're currently playing with. One significant one is around pay awards. So don't, I guess, be fooled is my message by a sort of a perception that the statement that the Chancellor made back in November that there would be a freeze on public sector pay. That only relates itself to NHS and central government bodies. There are other pay bodies, such as for teachers, which is for which Wales has its own independent pay remuneration body, and in fact local government staff, they will set their own pay awards. We do not know what they are going to be yet, but when Welsh Government issued the settlement, it basically has said, there's your funding for next year. You have to absorb and manage the impact of whatever the pay awards turn out to be. That is problematic. We have a 1% uplift in pay modelled into our assumptions. If it goes any higher than that, then we will have to, you know, that will fall as a further pressure for us to manage. Furthermore, in terms of specific grant funding, as is always the case at this stage of the year, it's an evolving picture, and we hope as we move towards the final settlement in early March from Welsh Government that we'll have a lot more information and a lot more comfort around that. My intelligence at the moment is suggesting that things are looking okay. Most grants on an all Wales level are broadly flatlining, and there is some injection that we're trying to work through at the minute in some specific grant funding pots. On the capital front, funding's been broadly maintained, and again, we're waiting for clarification on specific streams. I think, Chair, and the committee, you will know from the month 7 report. I'm sure it will. You know, the COVID funding from Welsh Government will have been touched on. So whilst you know it is a remaining risk for us, you know we you know sort of thank Welsh Government in terms of the full funding of you know our costs and income losses to this point. We've got a pretty high level of comfort and reassurance that they will continue to be funded up until the end of this financial year. But in terms of next financial year, we are still awaiting the announcement in terms of what form that funding will take. We are still working on the basis that will continue to be fully funded through next year. And again, if it isn't, then that will bring further pressure onto us. And then the final bit then really is, and I guess just because of some of the challenges, I guess, faced with the pandemic, we do usually get to see some early steer around, you know, the business rate relief side of things for next year, and that usually features in the settlement pack. But that isn't the case this year, and I know there's a lot of hard lobbying from business groups at the moment for government or Welsh Government to share that information as early as possible, so businesses know what's available to them next year. Just in terms of, you know, beyond what I touched on earlier with council tax, in terms of funding from Welsh Government, you know, this graph just typifies the fact that, you know, we are the worst funded council in Wales per capita. If you can't read the writing, we're the one on the right, and quite a long way below the red line average. But I think sometimes we get some criticism for just focusing in on that specifically. So it's just worthwhile just explaining that, you know, council's core funding is made up primarily of council tax and that AEF contribution from Welsh Government through the settlement. What you'll see here is the split between AEF and council tax. What proportion of our total funding, our core funding, is made up of those two elements? And again, you will see Monmouthshire on the very right. We have to raise a lot more of our core income from council tax, 34.4% actually, against that Welsh average of 23%. And just to finally close the loop on it, we talked about core funding per capita just with Welsh Government funding. This is a graph that I put together just showing core funding per capita, and that's AEF plus council tax for the authority. It just emphasises again, reaffirms that, you know, we do per head in terms of our total core funding, you know, we fall quite a way below the Welsh average. So in terms of the budget proposals for next year, I guess at headline level, and this is quite a key slide, the first bullet point, certainly the first two bullet points will be of very relevant to this committee. It does recognise in full all paid pension related spending pressures in schools. And furthermore, it does recognise all those increasing demands placed on both children's and adult social services, and furthermore children with additional learning needs. And you'll know from the Month 7 report the extent of those pressures, and that have flowed through into next year. We are also incorporating quite a significant pressure to respond to the revised and updated policy position of Welsh Government. And that I think regardless of which we would have been looking to invest in anyway, and in terms of the needs of the homeless. There's, I guess, limited scope to drive efficiency savings for frontline services, and whilst in part that is because you know, things are becoming harder and harder every year, it's actually probably more so because it draws a significant amount on the organisation's capacity to develop these proposals, these savings proposals, and actually to bring them forward and implement them. And again, to my earlier point in terms of a thoughtful approach around the budget, I think if we'd have pushed the organisation to have to entertain significant proposals of redesign and saving, I think you'd probably ended up breaking the organisation in terms of its workforce. So it's very much the reason as to why the budget strategy is somewhat different to the last few years. In terms of fees and charges, again, an important point. We are seeing increases, you know, in line with inflation, but we again have limited those as much as possible. And I'm sure, for example, Nikki and Ty will talk to those later on. And again, in terms of organisational priorities, our key point here is to make sure that we're not closing services, we're maintaining and sustaining them. And again, that's what we've looked to do for next year. Not too much to talk to here, but in terms of the summary position on the numbers, the key bit is that the budget proposals have accommodate that £10 million of pressures, and there are an amount of savings also included that total 3.7 million, which I'll come on to in a moment. This is in the pack. I'm not going to talk to it significantly, but it's just a broad reconciliation of the savings and pressures. The key number to just reference, because it's not shown elsewhere in the pack, is that on the bottom, noting the one-off use of our general reserves, the council fund contribution of just under £750,000. Again, slightly unprecedented, something that in an usual year I certainly wouldn't be advocating as a Section 151 officer, but again, it is a needs must in order to support the budget for next year. There's a few slides here that I'm not going to talk to significantly, but this one is just to demonstrate, I guess, the makeup of the budget. And I think all members of the Select Committee will be aware of, you know, where the broad spend sits itself. Children and young people there with that 55.6 million, which is 34% of our budget, and social care and health at just over 50 million, and again 31.2% of the budget. And then obviously with operational services being that third significant segment, and the lettering of other aspects of what makes up the services that we run, and then obviously the proper running of the council. But in total, a net expenditure budget of £162 million, and that's based on the current year budgets. I'm not going to talk through these significantly, Chair, but they're just really for members' understanding, and in terms of what the makeup of the directorates are. I'll make this slide deck available to members of the Select Committee in case they want to pore over them later, just for, if anything, just familiarisation. But it just again talks through the main parts of how services are in fact groups. So I'm happy to come back to any aspect of that later on if there's any questions. So in terms of the £10 million of pressures, which is being accommodated in the budget, I guess you'll see, and significantly there at the top in terms of children and young people, and in social care and health, together with some significant pressures within enterprise as to where the core pressures are having to be accommodated. And again, they are significantly and principally driven by pressures relating to demand increase, inflationary increases, and in fact legislative changes. We have, and as we always do, go through a process of challenge to ensure that where we can, we've either managed and absorbed pressures or in fact mitigated them. But I guess it's been a much more difficult exercise to be able to do that this year, given the pandemic. So the key pressures fall across, as you see on the slide there, bullet point by bullet point. Children with an ALN, a lot of that pressure is pressure featuring in month 7 that you've just heard, and that will roll into next year. And similarly with children's services and the looked after children pressures, which also, and as I heard you talking latterly, Chair, around agency costs and in fact legal costs being needing to be accommodated as well. Recycling and waste, there's an array of cost pressures that we are having to accommodate there. They are offset, in fact, within some of the savings proposals and some of the decisions that Cabinet has actually made in year, which I'll come to in a minute. And then in passenger transport unit, we've seen quite a lot of pressure just that have resulted again from catchment changes in terms of increase in the numbers that we're having to transport. Increased staffing costs, some of that consequential to what we're having to do as a consequence of COVID, and that will remain through next year. And again, in terms of the fragility of the current market, and where contracts have been handed back and that we've had to take on as a council and deliver. Adult social care, unsurprisingly, again, has seen additional demand pressures, and apology. That shouldn't say with adults with disabilities. That's my error. There are demand pressures in other areas, and that, again, Tyrone will talk to, but the figure itself is correct. So apologies on that one. Homelessness, I've mentioned, that signifies the level of investment needing to go in there, and obviously to keep people off the streets in the county. We have had to work through discussions around pay pressures. So just to be clear to the committee, when we laid the budget for the current year, that was predicated on a 1% pay award uplift. And the actual pay award came through at 2.75%. That's just for local government staff. We have absorbed that in the current year as much as we are able to, but we've done quite a thorough piece of work, and particularly in social care, it's a case where, because of we have to deliver frontline services, there's not an inch of spare capacity within that. We have had to acknowledge and incorporate that further aspect of pay award and staff efficiency savings that can't be met into the budget. Income shortfalls, I'm happy to respond to sort of any specifics in terms of member questions, but we've had to, beyond the pandemic, we've had to incorporate a lot of pressure at this end, particularly around commercial investment income, but our budgets around that. and also in terms of planning income, there's a whole variety of different pressures and income shortfalls that we've had to accommodate. And again, cognizant of the fact that we've very much limited where we've raised fees and charges. And then finally, just in terms of corporate costs, things that unfortunately we can't do anything about, but we have seen increases in presets and levies and costs around insurance and our pension strain costs. On the savings front, I think traditionally members will have seen this table featuring a much more significant savings figure. Certainly, if you look back over the last few years, for the reasons I've explained, that's a lot lower. As I say, it's been exacerbated by that pandemic, and the officer time that has obviously been needed to be diverted towards that. And obviously, we've had an in-year position to deal with as well by way of the recovery plan, which you'll just have heard an update on with month 7. So again, with that very challenging backdrop, the savings package is really comprised of savings that have resulted from decisions Cabinet has already taken. Our decision to continue use of capital receipts to fund costs of service reform, a limited increase in income generation that has come from fees and charges, and then some additional specific grant funding where we have had early notification of that in a positive sense from Welsh Government. So points of relevance really here in terms of the makeup of that. Obviously, we've got the full release of the savings from Mountain House Special School, the individual school budget there and its closure. We're drawing £1 million through that flexible use of capital receipts. £685,000 of savings around recycling and waste. Members of the committee will be aware of the decisions that Cabinet has presided over during the year. Those are sort of itomised there under that bullet point. And then finally, just to sort of highlight those fees and charges increases, whilst totalling 415 grand, 252 grand of that results from additional ALN recoupment income from our mainstream schools. So if you take the 252 off the 415, it's a relatively modest level of income rise from fees and charges, certainly given the size of the council. We have benefited in adult social care from an early notification in terms of a very helpful increase in the social care workforce and sustainability grant, which has benefited us by the tune of about 247 grand. And we're obviously taking the opportunity to embed some of the practice and culture change around our use of accommodation and how we travel as an organisation. So we're accommodating a level of saving in and around that, which again, obviously, is benefiting the planet as well as our finances. In terms of the impact of the proposals, and when I talk to impact, I'm talking here about equality impact, well-being, future generation aspect. Proposals where it's necessary have had their own individual assessments undertaken. It's a thanks to Richard Jones in the performance team and his colleagues in the fact that they've pulled together an overall wellbeing future generation assessment, which is sat as part of the budget proposals. And I guess the summation of that is that there could be impacts on residents around resulting from the increase in council tax. And that increase of 4.95%. Also, some of the limited increases in fees and charges. But I think, as I've talked about there, because mitigation here is obviously a key feature. We have a council tax reduction scheme in place to support those low earners, and equally single-person households can also benefit from discounts. Similarly, and Tyrone can talk to this later. Certainly, the charges for domiciliary and residential care, which are sort of factored in on an inflation increase basis, that they are also means tested. They are also capped, to again mitigate that impact on those on lowest incomes. So if I just step off revenue just briefly and just come on to capital, I guess the core features of the capital budget proposals, that ongoing commitment to fund the Future Schools programme, the Band B programme in the first instance with a business case currently being developed for the Abergavenny proposal, We're obviously continuing our commitment, our investment into the Cardiff Capital region. In terms of borrowing for commercial investments and acquisitions, I think all members will be aware, because it was a matter debated at council, but we have adjusted our commercial risk appetite as a result of the pandemic. We haven't made any commercial investments in the current year, and clearly we are managing the current situation with our current investments. In terms of Seven View Care Home replacement, I've only noted it really because it's a feature of and embedded within the current capital budget, the current year. But again, that will roll forward into 21-22 capital budget by way of some element of slippage, and in terms of certainly delivery and implementation will come forward in the coming months. Beyond that, in terms of our maintenance budgets, they will be maintained at current levels. Similarly with disabled facilities grants and access for all budgets. And just that final point, just to make it, re-emphasize the point, we are propping up and supporting the revenue budget through a continued use of one-off capital receipts. Clearly that has an implication in terms of depleting our capital receipts so that it's not available for other aspects of the capital budget. I'm not intending to go through this full list, but this list in effect encapsulates all the array of capital budget pressures and future considerations that council will need to have regard to. Obviously Band B and Band C, backlog maintenance issues, issues around, even ash tree dieback beyond investment in homelessness, low cost of affordable housing, which is something that the Cabinet is still committed to, and the list goes on. Climate emergency, investments around modern life. So there's a whole array of things that are currently as yet unfunded, and they will be future considerations for the council, certainly over the medium term. In terms of key risks and uncertainties, I think I've probably talked to most of this. Obviously, there's uncertainties around the continued impact of the pandemic, in terms of whilst government funding continuing to cover us for those COVID-related aspects. The volatility, which I'm sure this committee is fully cognizant of, particularly with children's services, in terms of volatility of in those areas, as well as ALN and adult social care. And again, levels of uncertainty around specific grant funding for next year, pay award, and in terms of limited available balances available to us going forward. So, this is not, we're not. I'm certainly not in a secure position. The council's not in a wholly secure position in terms of its finances, but certainly we're not alone. Certainly not in Wales, and certainly not in the UK. But it's a case of looking to move forward and being cognizant and aware of all of these risks and uncertainties, being eyes wide open. And as Treasurer, I will continue to advise senior leadership team, Cabinet, and the Council in terms of any adjustments that we need to make as we move forward. And that very much typifies the look ahead over the medium term. I think it would be almost impossible at this point to guess or predict what the outcome will be on public sector finances, on local government funding in Wales beyond next year. The Chancellor only announced a one-year funding settlement for that very reason, because of the uncertainties caused by the pandemic. And so I guess we wait till March and April time, which is when we await to hear formally next from the Chancellor. And let's wait and see what that offers forward to see whether any anticipated tightening of public sector finances is going to be coming very soon, or whether the Chancellor is in fact going to hold that back because of the need to obviously deal with the recovery phase of the pandemic. But that may well lead us into some tricky decisions or tricky considerations as we work our way up into the budget for 22-23 and ahead of the local government election. So just finally, in terms of timescales, we're into off the back of Cabinet tomorrow, when the draft budget proposals will be considered and released. We've got a 4-week period of consultation. We've obviously got scrutiny committees taking place through this week and next week. The consultation ends on the 17th of February, and then we will work our way up then with a set of final budget proposals going to Cabinet on the 3rd of March. And then we have pushed back Council in order to allow for that 4-week consultation back to the 11th of March, which is in fact the last day that we're able to under the regulation. Chair, that is really really it in terms of the the broad and rounded assessment and the overview of the budget proposals in total. What I have done for the benefit of the Select Committee, I have put I think it's probably 3 slides. I think yeah, 3 slides in at the back, which if you don't mind, Chair, just for the, I think it might benefit the Select Committee for just Tyrone, Nikki and Tyrone, just to talk to just for 5 minutes or so, because these are the areas that fundamentally focus in on your specific portfolio. They are the things that feature within both the revenue and capital budget proposals that link themselves directly to CYP Select portfolio. So are you okay if I hand over maybe in the first instance to Nikki?
Yeah, and thanks for that very comprehensive and very clear presentation of quite a complex topic. It's probably one of the clearest presentations in terms of this overall view, and I think it's beneficial, for us as scrutiny members, but also for any of the general public who are actually watching this morning. But yeah, that's fine. If you want to hand over now to Nikki and to Tyrone, please.
Thank you, Chair. I'll manage the slide deck. So Nick, I know you were having issues with the Teams. Are you with us?
Yeah, no, that's fine. Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair. Thanks, Pete. Yeah, just to go through the ones relating to CYP in the initial slide. So CYP, the pressures are 1.47 million. Thank you. So these relate to, so 304,000 is relating to the recoupment income for Mountain House. Obviously, we won't be receiving that now as it's closed. Then the 387,000, which is made up of 2 elements. The first one is the 118,000 placement costs for the 3 remaining pupils. You'll remember that from my month 7 presentation earlier, and 269,000, which has previously been agreed for by Cabinet as an investment in the inclusion centres in the 4 secondary schools within our 4 towns. There's an additional 75,000 relating to educational psychology, which directly relates to the new ALN Act that comes into force, and it will be, this is staffing costs, so this will relate to staffing costs of psychology. There's 21,000 relating to early years, again in relation to the ALN Act and the additional responsibilities that are placed on the authority. The next 3 you will be aware of from the month 7, so they are month 7 pressures: 58,000 for independent placement costs, 130,000 for local authority placement costs, and the 494,000 which relates to the ALN support within our schools. As Pete mentioned earlier, the pay award is 1%, and that represents 431,000 for our schools. Okay.
Tyrone, are you happy to come in just to touch on the children's services aspect? Thanks.
Sure, no problem, Peter. In terms of children's services, the £1.61 million pressure, I already alluded to the major bulk of that being the 1.46 million, which was the overspend position as at month 7. Which came from the previous agenda item. 100,000 is something Peter mentioned around the 2% staff efficiency saving we have on our pay budget for staffing. Within children's services, this year that was recognised and funded, but the way we calculate it, we just need to make sure that is taken out for next year as well. And then the remaining element is an adjustment for the investment in the safeguarding team, which was previously funded through the use of the capital receipts programme for this financial year. That pretty much sums up the children's element of it. Thanks.
Thanks, Ty. If I am back to Nikki, and then if Nick, you can pick up the savings aspect, that's great.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Pete. So in terms of the savings for us, then obviously the major saving is the closure of Mountain House. So that's 1.258 million. And again, mentioned in the month 7 presentation is the additional income that we've received for pupils placed from other local authorities into our mainstream schools, 252,000, which is a combination of the number of pupils and the slight price increase that we put through to recover the costs. Thanks.
Thanks, Nick. Back to you, Ty.
In terms of children's services, those ones are savings in CYP in terms of the.
Yeah, so apologies, Ty. That seems to be an error in the slide deck.
Okay.
Yeah, so I don't think you've got any savings that you're bringing forward for children's services, have you?
No, all of the savings that we've got in terms of that sit within adult social care and was around charging that Pete had mentioned in his previous deck slide.
Yeah, apologies for that. Thanks, Ty. And then I think if I just wrap up just in terms of the capital programme, I think as touched on earlier, the key aspects for CYP Select, first off is obviously the Banby School development of that big business case in Abergavenny, and that will work its way through, and on the basis of obviously approval by Welsh Government of full business case, that will obviously come back into council for final consideration. Beyond that is just to recognise, I think importantly, that beyond that, firstly that we are maintaining at current year levels and across the 4 years of the capital MTFP, the investment in school kitchen upgrades and equally in the Access for All budgets for schools as well. And then the final point is just to highlight that I know that we've continued to work with Welsh Government on the specific grant funding side of house, and it has led us to being able to actually do further work and modification and improvement of our wider school estate through a combination of Welsh Government funding and Section 106 funding. So that's, Chair, I think that's probably, that is the end of the slideshow. I will try and get myself out of this now.
Right.
If I can.
Well, as I say, thanks, Peter, for that. Obviously, huge amount of information to take on board there. For the whole authority. I think one thing I'd say now, get into questions short but very quickly, but what I don't want is to go down into a very sort of breakdown into very detailed figures, and that it almost becomes a sort of a dialogue between the councillor and the senior officers here. So I think we've got to be fairly clear now in what we're asking. So go to Councillor Martin Groker to start, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Peter and Nikki and Tyrone. You mentioned, certainly in one of your slides there, Peter, that one of the things you don't know about at the moment is the added imposition of precepts from town councils and the police and so on. The Chair, Councillor Thomas and myself both sit on Abergavenny Town Council, and I'm delighted to be able to tell you that at our meeting last week, we brought in proposals for a standstill. So we will not be adding to your budget pressures next year as a town council. But my question is really concerning Monlife. And looking back a year or so, it was going to be floated free. And since it was decided to keep it in-house, we've been beset by all sorts of financial difficulties, and you did say in your opening comments that it was better to shave back on services rather than abandon them. And looking at Monlife, it must have lost a lot of revenue from schools who use our leisure centres for swimming lessons and so on. And that money will have gone from their budget. They're also, of course, losing money because the gyms are closed and there's a loss of direct debit money and all the rest of it. Are we happy that Mon Life will be able to ride the storm at the moment? Quite simple as that. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Grocott. It's welcome news just to hear that sort of freezing of levels for the town council. On the point around Mon Life, it's a very timely question actually, because we had the latest Mon Life exec board yesterday afternoon, and one of the items, in fact, on the agenda was just a 1-year look back. And suffice to say, timing probably couldn't have been any worse for Mon Life in terms of what came its way. It's yes, you're probably spot on. Beset with a whole array of unprecedented challenges is a fair assessment of it all. But I think probably two things in response. First off, and I think consistent with Month 7 as well, the income losses that Mon Life has suffered have been met, I think, almost in full, predominantly by Welsh Government through the COVID Hardship Fund. And it goes back to my earlier point, which is, I don't think it's high risk, because to Welsh Government's credit, they have followed through with the funding to date in terms of meeting income shortfalls that have been born as a result of the pandemic. I fully expect that to carry on until the end of the year, and I do expect that to be the case certainly through next year, until such time as those services are back up and running. And I actually, in fact, asked the question of Ian Saunders, who's the Chief Operating Officer for Mon Life, yesterday, alongside some dialogue with the Chief Executive, in terms of the levels of comfort, I guess, around the footfall returning, and he remains very confident that will happen when they can reopen and reopen fully. So I think in terms of the services being put back on a sure footing, on a sustainable footing, I'm pretty confident that that will be the case. The final point just to make is that Mon Life has, in fact, it's been a bit of a blessing in disguise in terms of whilst we have furloughed quite a number of staff, we have significantly drawn on that capacity release to support the Test, Trace and Protect, the TTP setup within Monmouthshire and Gwent. It's also gone and assisted our business grants administration in response to the pandemic, and it will also assist with supporting some of the pandemic rollout as well in terms of working with health. So it's not all bad news on that front.
Okay, thanks for that. Councillor Louise Brown.
Yes, thank you. Yes, thank you for the presentation. Just wondered if we could be sent a copy of the slides, or the slides that you will use for the consultation process. The first question is about looked after children for Julie Boothroyd. Basically about, because our levels have increased and this has created quite a lot of pressure, is there any scope for arguing for any additional funding through specific grants or anything else from the Welsh Government, particularly if our increase is a lot more than other authorities? My second question is to Nicola. It's about the Mountain House School. It mentioned that there's 3 remaining pupils. Are they actually based still at Mountain House School, and is that under the PRU unit? I'm not quite sure what the situation is there, and what's the plans for the 3 pupils who are remaining. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. If we go to Julie Boothroyd first, please. Sorry, in terms of this issue of any grants for looked after children.
Apologies, Chair. I was just taking a phone call. I understand there may have been a question.
Yeah, sorry.
Sorry, if you just recap the question for me, that'd be really helpful.
Yes, Councillor Louise Brown was asking, because of the increase in looked after children, is there any scope for further sort of grants from Welsh Government or anybody else to sort of defray some of those costs? I think that was the question in a nutshell.
Okay, there have been some very small amounts of funding that have come through this year that have helped around the periphery, but nothing specifically targeted towards looked after children. Members may be aware, but it must be a year or more ago that we were all, as 22 local authorities, a task force was set up from Welsh Government that came out to assess our strategy, if you like, around the reduction in looked after children. And I think we have to report on a quarterly basis as to how we're progressing with that. So we do know that this is being observed very, very closely from a Welsh Government perspective. As Ty mentioned earlier, our numbers plateaued a little bit this year, and we're hoping that that's going to continue. The approach that we have taken around early intervention and prevention and bolstering those provisions, which is where some of the grant money, small pockets that have come to assist us with that, are helpful. And we're hoping that we may be able to, I suppose through the evidence that's been gathered from that, be able to secure potentially other monies. But it hasn't been specifically targeted towards the looked after population. It's much more about prevention of that, which is where we've seen some of the investment, like I say, small pockets, but obviously welcomed by us, and we've been able to mobilise extra support into that early help provision to try and prevent escalation further up into more expensive, costly services.
Okay, thanks. And Nicola Wellington, would you like to come in on the Mountain House question, please?
Yeah, certainly. So obviously when Mountain House closed, there were more than 3 pupils in there. The 3 pupils that Councillor Brown are referring to were the Monmouthshire pupils. So I can just confirm that 2 have now moved and are in independent provision, and 1 is moved and moved over to the PRS. All 3 I've mentioned in the month 7 presentation and in the budget presentation. We've built in the costs going forward, and obviously we'll keep those costs on our tracker, which was again mentioned earlier, to ensure that we can meet those costs for those pupils going forward.
Okay.
So can I check?
Yes.
I just ask. So does that mean at the moment there's just because my understanding was that there was PRS was going to be based in the Mountain House School. Is that correct? And is that just 1 pupil of the remaining 1 that were there when the school was closed? And are there other pupils for the PRS based there?
At the moment, there's no pupils in the PRS in Mountain House. Mountain House remains at the moment vacant. It is an option that we're looking at, but obviously there's cost implications, etc., that we need to work through. Obviously, there would be a business case to back that provision if we do decide to move in that way, and it wouldn't be 1 pupil. No, it would be the PRS service.
Yeah, because my understanding was that was the way it was intended to go at the, at the closure time. So that's why I was asking the question. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Any other questions from members of the committee, please? Councillor Watts, you've got your hand up. Is that a new hand or an old one, just for clarity? Do you want to come in there?
Yeah, I do, Chair. Sorry, I do apologise. The software just froze there a second.
Okay.
Yeah, I wondered if Peter could just go back to the council tax collection slide, if that's possible. Just to, is he still with us?
Yes. I am Councillor Watts. So which specific one? Sorry, there were a number of them.
Collection, so you very helpfully kind of presented to members the amount of revenue you get per banding, really, and I just wanted to draw on that as part of my question. I thought it would be helpful.
Okay, just 1 second, Councillor.
If you don't mind, I can ask the question without it.
That's fine. Is that the slide, Councillor?
No, it's got all the local authorities. Well, no, it's got the back. No, you've got the back. It's specifically the back. That's it, really. So what it was that, you know, historically, and Phil will probably know what's coming. Historically, there've been issues about council tax collection, and what I'm particularly interested in or worried in is that obviously the demographic changes that will occur then as a consequence of economic changes related to COVID across Monmouthshire, and our ability to collect, because historically where we've struggled to collect and written, not always, well, in many cases, most of the debt is in Band B and Band C, and sometimes we haven't been favourable, say, in relation to other similar kind of affluent local authorities. And my overall concern is, have you properly evaluated, and I know it's a bit of a kind of crystal ball, the economic impact that has on families? And I'll give you an example. My son's school, which you know is not in county, has a 40% uptake on school dinners. That's a remarkable uptake, and what I'm worried about is a similar kind of picture across Monmouthshire, demographically very similar, and our potential problem that we have then of retrieving council tax. Do you feel confident that you factored that in? That's kind of question one. And then I also want to look at risk. You put right at the end of it, you presented a list of potential risks. So, you know, I asked, and members do occasionally, it's kind of like the opposition's dummy's guide to being in opposition, the at-risk register. The at-risk register, not everything that you presented there really reflects in what's in the at-risk register. And we talked very briefly, and I don't want to, I take on board what the chairman quite rightly says, we don't want to get into specifics, but when we come to looking at overall investments, are we confident really evaluating the problem that exists with those investments, that we're not impacting our ability to borrow in the future? Is that not also a potential risk? Those are my questions. Thank you very much, Chair.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, thank you, Chair. Thank you, Councillor Watts. So just in terms of the first question, absolutely the case, just in terms of the assessment that's been undertaken and has led, I guess, to two things here. One is, let's try not to get too technical. So in terms of the tax yield that we get from council tax, that's predicated on us determining a council tax base for the council. So that one of the drivers behind that is a forecast and an assessment of the number of chargeable dwellings. So it's understanding as to any new properties that are being built. That's probably the lesser consideration, coming back to Councillor Watt's question. The second key consideration is around the council tax collection rate. We've had quite lengthy discussions and been poring over evidence and our forecasts and assumptions around that. We have in fact retained an underlying assumption of a 99% collection rate. One of the reasons for that is because our data is still showing, it's actually showing strength and actually a positive rebound on collection. I guess if we compare ourselves to certain other authorities in Wales, I guess on the whole, we've got a much stronger sort of recovery sort of position, really, given the nature of people across Monmouthshire and their circumstances. So we've been able to. We're comfortable that we've got enough headroom in the collection rate to be able to hold it at 99%. I think that we then come back to, I guess, what is the nub of that first question, which is around, sufficient due consideration of the challenges that I guess people in our communities are facing. And that really comes at the heart of the what I refer to Richard Jones and his team have done in terms of looking at the overall wellbeing future generation equality impact assessment. Council tax is a key feature of that. So if Councillor Watts, you haven't digested that in full yet, then I maybe point you towards that and the narrative contained therein. That's looked at the impact not just of council tax rise, but the impact of the array of the budget proposals, increasing fees and charges, you know, and where that ends up at times with some of those on lowest incomes. I guess I echo in counterpoint in terms of the mitigation to my earlier point around, you know, the likes of the council tax reduction scheme, the likes of the discounts that are available to families. And it's, again, you know, a very difficult and tricky balance to strike when you're in a set of circumstances that the council is with its finances. And I guess the position that not me, it's not, you know, it's not my decision, not my recommendation. It's one of Cabinet to make in terms of what they feel that they can look to propose as part of the budget proposals. So as mentioned earlier, you know, that is a 4.95% increase. But again, you know, there are those safeguards and mitigations in place around the subsidy that's and discounts that are on offer. In terms of the second question, yes, it's right. I wasn't aiming to be exhaustive and, in fact, detailed in terms of that slide on risks and considerations. But there's a good reason for that, in fact, because I guess if you take a couple of the bullets on that slide, you know, one talks about the pressures that as currently we're not aware of. And that's what the strategic risk register is. That is highlighting where we have matters of concern, matters of risk that might not materialise, but it could, and they remain strategic risks for the council. But clearly, we build the budget. It is predicated on a set of assumptions, and chief officers will preside over the pressures that they are currently facing. You know, if, for example, I'll just take an example. If Julie came to me and asked for another £2 million to be inserted into the budget proposals for children's services pressures, when she wasn't able to actually evidence that that was going to be forthcoming next year, I think that's something that wouldn't work its way into the budget proposals. So the reasonable assumption that's been introduced is based on, you know, the lack of pressure that we're having to accommodate at the minute to look after children pressure. And the fact that it's stabilised at the moment. I think if it hadn't stabilised and we were seeing a continued increase, then I guess our discussions with Julie and her team would be slightly different. But we look at each one in isolation and we just comfort ourselves on the underlying assumptions. What I don't want to do as a treasurer is to walk into next year based on risks that are probably more probable than likely, because if they're probable, then, you know, prudence would suggest that you need to take regard and incorporate them in some way in your budget. But there are many risks that the council faces that are just remote or possible. They're not probable, and to that end, we just need to make sure that we have regard to them. So there's no point in me. You know, I could exhaust our entire reserves in one foul swoop on the basis of, you know, squaring a budget, but that would put me in a very good position for coming years.
Okay. Councillor Watts, do you want to come back on that or not?
I hear what he said. I mean, it was a very interesting answer by Peter, but I guess my concern is that you know, what if we're looking forward beyond this year, the next year, as we always do. Peter's responsibility, he knows, is to look into a kind of he's got to look into a financial crystal ball and then make the best options or try and read it as best he possibly can. And I understand what he's telling me, but I guess the back end of my question was our ability, looking at the existing risks and our potential risk, that our inability to borrow, that might have a potential risk then on funding going forward across the board. Sorry, I know that's a rather academic, boring question, and anybody outside of this, looking at this, will think, you know, what is Councillor Watts on about? But that's my question.
Sorry, Councillor. I forgot. I was remiss of me not to actually close the loop there and refer back to that latter point that you raised around borrowing. Just to be just to be clear. So we're governed by what is called the Prudential Code, and the Prudential Code determines that our borrowing needs to be affordable, sustainable, and prudent. It's underpinned by a set of what is called prudential indicators, and that sets various thresholds within which we work. So to your point, Councillor, we have a sufficiency of headroom in our borrowing capabilities, and ultimately, the ability to be able to determine as to whether our borrowing at any one point is sustainable, prudent, and affordable. That will be couched within our ability to fund it within the revenue budget, i.e. the borrowing costs in terms of interest and repayment, which is called MRP. So I don't have any concerns in that regard at this point. And if you want to pore over further information, the Treasury strategy will be going up into Audit Committee and then up into Council on the 11th of March. And that will actually draw those conclusions if you want a deeper look into it.
Okay. Okay. Thanks for that, Councillor Louise Brown.
Thank you, Chair. I did originally ask the question of whether or not we could have the slides, and I didn't get an answer on that because I think it would be helpful if we could, because obviously they've been made publicly available because people can freeze a screen and actually look at them. One of the questions I've got two questions. I'm trying to restrict myself to two, which is very difficult for me. Question one is basically you mentioned $750,000 of the reserves were going to be used. What reserves after that will we have left? And the second question I've got, in a sense, relates to the concern that Councillor Watts was talking about, is that our reliance so much on raising money through council tax. And I thought the interesting slide was the one where you compared us with other local authorities in terms of our percentages of council tax. But one of the arguments why the other local authorities get funded from the Welsh Government on a better basis is because of the fact that we have more properties in the band D and above, whereas other councils don't. But I thought the most revealing slide was the one when you combine the two, effectively to show that we still had less per capita, even per head, even allowing for that. And I don't know whether you could show that slide again, because obviously one of the arguments we've had is just basically based on Welsh Government and our average per capita. But I think the most revealing one was that if we add the council tax and the amount we get from WG, we still get less. I think it's that one, isn't it? Yeah. And I think that is one of the main arguments that we should be putting forward. I don't know whether I'm allowed to ask a third question.
I will allow it. I'm
trying to be as specific as I can. The third question is about sort of looking forward to the future, because we've got the trend of the ageing population that will actually possibly decrease our council revenue from the point of view of the fact that people will be eligible for the single person 25% discount. And I just wondered if that had been taken into account as well. Thank you.
Okay. Yes. Peter, do you want to come back on that, on those questions, please? I assume the slide deck will go out anyway. I think that's taken as read, I would assume.
Yeah, we'll circulate the slide deck back out to the members of the Select Committee. But it's useful for me just to mention that clearly with the pandemic, things are slightly strange. In an ordinary year, we'd be going out and meeting with, well, as much as yourselves face to face in a Select Committee, we'd be going out to meet the public. in various ways to consult on the budget proposals. Clearly that can't happen. So it's very much a virtual consultation that we will run over the next 4 weeks. But just in case, I guess, members are directing their constituents send them towards the website. So probably Wednesday, Thursday this week, as soon as we get through Cabinet tomorrow, the budget page on the website will be stood up. That will contain an overview just in terms of the budget. It will contain a link to the core budget consultation presentation, the budget papers. The Cabinet member, Phil Murphy, will be doing a budget blog that will also be put on there. So, and there's also an online feedback form for members of the public to be able to feedback on the budget proposal. So that's number one. Okay. The second point, just in terms of the average core funding per capita. I know, and again, we've got Councillor Murphy on the call. I don't know whether Phil wants to just come in and offer a comment here, but I guess just in terms of teeing him up, I think it's been a long-standing matter really for Cabinet in terms of issues in terms of how the funding formula works and how, I guess, Monmouthshire, as Councillor Brown points out, is disadvantaged. By the way it gets it, you know, the level of funding it gets through from Welsh Government. And I know that the leader, for example, sits on the WLGA's rural forum, and you know, I think there's certainly a feeling that rural councils are actually disadvantaged in the way that the current formula carves, you know, that limited pot of funding up. But Phil,
can I just cut in very briefly there, and not your fault, Peter, and sorry to cut across you there, but I think really now we're getting into the sort of discussion that is more, you know, valid in sort of full council, etc., because we're getting into the technical thing of whole authority, and reality, you know, in reality we're obviously here in CYP. So I think if you just answer briefly on that, and then we'll come to a conclusion. Because I think the questions are really outside CYP remit, you know, not your fault, Peter, at all.
No, that's fine. That's fine, Chair. That's your prerogative, absolutely. So I don't know, Phil, do you want to wrap up that point just to close it off?
I can do, Peter. Yeah, thank you for letting me in, Chair. No, really, on challenging to the formula, the leader has been really pushing, and together with other leaders, but particularly the leader of Conwy, have been pressing for an independent review of the formula. I think it's the only way we're going to get anywhere with that. We're just batting our head against a brick wall otherwise. I think the only answer is an independent review so it can be looked at more objectively.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Murphy.
Can I just ask the question? We were told that there was £750,000 used for reserves, and I wondered what was left of that. And the other question was about the you know, the future of more discounts because of the elderly population. Thank you.
Everything to do
with respect. We're getting into, you know, issues about the elderly population, etc. I feel it's outside the remit now of CYP. You know, we get into broader issues, which will be discussed, you know, at a further date. And you know, time is running. We're now just a minute off 12. So, unless Phil wants to come in very quickly,
can I suggest that anybody who wants to ask any general questions, if they look at the Cabinet papers, all of the answers to those questions are in there.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Well, we move on now. I've really got to thank Peter and Nikki and Tyrone for their inputs this morning, and particularly Peter for taking us through a very, you know, a long document really with a slide deck and presenting it clearly. And we've had broad discussion, we've had questions, and I'm not going to run over what Peter said, but discussions about Monlife which were answered in terms of sustainability. And also issues about grants for looked after children, which Julie Boothroyd answered. And then a question by Councillor Armand Watts about tax collection, which probably again was somewhat broader, and questions that Louise Brown put, which again were broader. So, you know, once again, for the three of you, thank you very much. Diolch yn fawr. And, you know, we welcome the input. I think we're much clearer now in terms of what's going to happen in the future. We now move on to item 7, and I hand over now to Will McLean, who's the Chief Officer for Children and Young People, who is going to give us a brief verbal update on the position in schools regarding blended learning. So I'll hand over to Will. Thanks very much.
Good morning, or good afternoon, nearly. Thank you, Chair, and good afternoon, everybody. Grateful for the opportunity to join you today just to talk through the return to school and to touch on some of the blended learning aspects of that return to school. My colleague Sharon Randall-Smith is, I think, in Select as well at the moment. So if there are some potentially technical questions on some of the pedagogical issues and so on around remote learning, then I'm sure Sharon will be able to pick those up. But in the first instance, I thought it'd be useful if I just gave the committee a recap as to where we are in terms of schooling provision, how we've got there, and what that means for our students. So just to turn the clock back a little bit to the towards the end of the last term, the 17th of December, decision was made by the local authority in full conjunction with our head teachers about our return to school plans for the start of the spring term 2021. There was agreement that the first 2 days of the term should be remote learning for all learners, and that everybody should return to face-to-face learning on the 6th of January. I think at that point, people were keen to make sure that they met the Welsh Government's expectations and regulations with regarding supporting critical workers and vulnerable learners. But they were also really very keen to make sure that children didn't miss any more face-to-face teaching than they had in the autumn term. So having made that decision, we communicated that to parents, but we did know that we'd get together on Monday, the 4th of January, to discuss that position, because obviously during that Christmas break, we obviously had the potential for families to get together on Christmas Day, and there was a concern that COVID cases might have increased. When we met on the 4th of January, we talked about changing our plans. However, our discussions locally were superseded by the minister's intervention. And I think the prevailing kind of the meta narrative and the metadata regarding COVID, the introduction of the new variant, although not the dominant variant in South Wales, and the just the shockingly high case rates and death rates across the UK as a whole had changed the tenor and the tone of the discussion. And the minister made her announcement that schools would remain, all schools would remain on remote learning until the 18th of January. Just for committee's awareness, when we made the decision to come back on the 6th of January, the rate in Monmouthshire was 409 per 100,000. When we talked about it again on the 4th, that rate had fallen to 316 per 100,000. It was falling. So we believe that we were in a position whereby, although the rate was still significantly higher than we would have wanted it to be, it was still travelling in the right direction. So those debates then with the minister continued, and then on Friday the 8th of January, the minister made her announcement that education would form part of the 3-weekly review cycle alongside all governmental interventions in Wales, that there would be no face-to-face learning for the vast majority of pupils until the 28th of January at the very earliest, and it was likely to be half term before the majority of pupils began to be phased back into school. And I think what surrounded that debate and discussion were two kind of core factors. The first was, were schools a safe place for children and staff to be? And the second was the contribution that closing schools to face-to-face learning impacts on the R number. And they sound very similar, but they're quite different actually in terms of the question. And certainly the discussions and debates that we've had with our colleagues in the trade unions and so on focus on the first aspect, but always have due regard for the second factor, which is that reduction in the community transfer. So what does that mean for our schools? It means that all of our schools are currently open. It means that all of our schools are providing remote learning offers to the vast majority of their pupils. But there are two key exceptions to that, and they are the population of children in Monmouthshire who are vulnerable. And we've worked very carefully and closely with our colleagues in social services to determine six kind of different categories of learners who fall into that group, and they're able to access school at any time. And our underlying principle in that area is that anybody who is safer in school than at home should be in school, and that's a clear guiding principle for us. And the second is the children of critical workers who are able to access face-to-face support in school. And there have been a couple of changes to that critical worker list and process from the first lockdown, when our schools kind of provided hub provision. The first is that it's become apparent that only one parent has to be a critical worker to be able to access the provision. And the second is that the Welsh Government has published a list of occupations that it believes to be critical workers. In law, we have in regard to that, and having sought advice in paying due regard, the argument we would have to be advancing to exclude a certain profession would be a very difficult one. So we've just taken that list as read, and that's the list that we work to. What we do continually stress is that the provision in school for face-to-face support should be a last resort for families, not a first resort. However, what is interesting, and I'll talk about the critical workers first, is that we've had 908 children registered as critical workers, and on average last week 570 attended school. That's across both primary and secondary. And we have had 363 vulnerable learners registered, and on average 218 attended on a daily basis last week. And I think the range of numbers attending school ranges from, and it's entirely dependent on where a school is and the nature of its context and the community it serves. But you know, we've got Osbaston School has 100 children registered, and then we've got some of our schools in the very rural areas who might have actually no children registered, or maybe just one or two children. The one thing I would draw to your attention is that's a significant increase on the last week of hub provision, when I think we were seeing about 400 children attend. So we are seeing significantly more children being supported by their school this time than we did last time. I would also advise members that that rate is likely to increase if we remain in the remote learning pattern for an extended period of time. I think this is challenging for a whole range of reasons. There are challenges in terms of delivery, because schools are expected now to deliver education, and that's a fundamentally different point. So when we repurposed schools in the spring of 2020, in March, our schools were repurposed to provide childcare, and that was a significant difference. This time, the regulations that the Welsh Government has laid are very clear that we are providing education, and that's a key difference. So the children who are accessing that face-to-face provision are expecting educational support and provision, and not childcare. And that does draw on the resources of the school, because they're obviously having to support children in school and children who are accessing remote learning. So there's two kind of forms of learning ongoing. That has an impact on staff management, and we've been in extensive debates with our head teachers and our trade union colleagues about how staff are managed in this period of time. The other thing which it does bring is significant pressure on parents, and this is something that I'm acutely aware of. We have schools where there are very, very high parental expectations, and we know that there are families who, for a range of entirely good reasons, don't always have the means by which to support their children and so on. So it's very, very difficult line for schools to tread, which is, for those some families who want more work and some families who want more flexibility. And it's a difficult line for our schools to tread, but we're working closely as a local authority with our colleagues in the Education Achievement Service to look and identify how we can structure that in terms of best practice. And clearly, you know, the underlying part, and I go back to my comment about the vulnerable children, about children being better off in school than at home. The fundamental part throughout this period is about children's well-being. That's absolutely critical, that we have to think about that. And again, you know, we're going to another period of time. We hope for the majority of children it will be concluded by half term, but that's by no means a definite. And actually, over time, we need to think about how we establish that well-being support and really engage with our learners in this remote learning environment. And it's difficult across the age ranges. It's difficult, you know, if you can imagine, you know, sometimes the teaching of a secondary class and how they engage vis-a-vis a primary phase, you know, a foundation phase group of children. These are very different groups to think about how we use remote learning for. And those are some of those critical factors that we have to think about. Just in terms of that, the piece around the blended learning and the remote learning, I thought it might be helpful if I just touch on some definitions, because I think one of the things which has happened is that a whole new vocabulary, a whole new kind of range of descriptors has emerged since the first lockdown, and I thought it'd be helpful just to use some definitions for you. So in our literature, in our discussions, we talk about distance learning, which is the same as remote learning. So we would define that as an approach that combines face-to-face and distance learning experiences. Face-to-face learning and distance learning should complement each other and should be driven by a single curriculum. We often talk about blended learning. Blended learning is where learners are provided with a combination of face-to-face learning and distance learning tasks and activities. And one of the things that you'll often hear about is the flipped classroom. That's one of the things which is often referred to with regards to blended learning. Face-to-face learning is the learning that our children receive when they are actually within an educational setting, as in they are in a school. And two really important phrases, which are, they're again new words really since March, but synchronous learning. And synchronous learning is where teachers and learners attend a session or lesson at the same time, and that can take place face-to-face or online. So that, in other language, is the live lesson that many people will talk about, and in many instances is what certain families and sectors seem to believe is the preferential model of delivery. We'll come to touch on that in just a second. Asynchronous learning is where teachers provide learning materials, including videos, audio clips and presentations and so on, which are uploaded onto a platform such as Hub and then can be accessed by students at any time. So those are two really important differentials, synchronous and asynchronous learning. And online learning, for the final piece of clarity, is education that takes place over the internet. Sometimes we refer to this as e-learning, but online learning is just a different type of distance learning. So there's a range of phrases there which I hope are helpful, and certainly one thing I would say, members, on Thursday afternoon we've been really fortunate in that we've got 8 of our head teachers are coming to do an all members seminar. I think the invite went out yesterday. It'd be really good to have a really good attendance at that session, and those head teachers will talk to you about their approaches to all of those things that I've just talked through, and I think that will be a great opportunity for that. We continue to offer through the EAS a significant amount of professional learning for our schools to make sure that they are fully aware of the latest tools and techniques and approaches, and that's a key part of the role that Sharon undertakes on behalf of Monmouthshire, working with our colleagues there. We are looking at how we can develop and explore best practice and share that across the whole region, because I think that's going to be vitally important in the future. So, Chair, I'll probably be going to about quarter now, so I'll wrap it up there. But obviously, myself and Sharon would be more than happy to take questions. And I would just again remind members about the session on Thursday afternoon, and hearing it straight from the head teachers, I think, will be a great benefit.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that. I'm going to go to members of the committee first in terms of questions. Are there any questions or comments from members of the committee? I can see Councillor Maureen Powell.
Thank you, Chairman. It's something that we were talking about previously, And I have been reassured about the number of less fortunate children about having laptops or some means of having their learning. And I was told that most of the secondary schools anyway, that there aren't many now that haven't got some form of doing this learning, because the schools have been raising money and funds and all sorts of things to provide this. And I just wondered what the situation was like at the moment, Will.
Okay, thanks, Will.
Great, thank you, Councillor Powell. And remiss of me, I actually made notes this morning for my contribution, but that was the one section I missed out of the notes in front of me. In terms of kits, yeah, when we had the first lockdown, there was a really kind of significant push by all schools to provide children who needed access, and we did see our secondary schools give out significant amounts of kit. Clearly, it's really, really important. It's a critical aspect, and we've seen Estin publish last week a thematic review, and clearly for disadvantaged learners, the ability to have the necessary kit to access learning is a key part. Since we returned, it was a first consideration for us when the Minister made her statement on Monday, the 4th, that we needed to understand what level of need there was. So we've been working closely with the schools and then closely with the digital team in the corporate centre. As of yesterday, we had 37 requests for laptops across our schools. Those have been sourced and they will be with those families by the end of this week. The route we go down is that we find devices which we're able to provide to families. We then install something called Neverware, which in essence turns a laptop into a Chromebook, and we provide those to families, which provides all the functionality the family will need to enable them to access Hub and Google Classroom and other platforms which are used to provide learning to children. That's in terms of kit to access. If the access itself in terms of broadband is a problem, we purchased at the beginning of the pandemic a significant number of devices which are called MiFi, which are broadband dongle devices which provide direct internet connection for learners. We have a number of those left. And we will continue to provide those where families need access to the broadband to be able to access learning and so on. One positive thing, the Welsh Government did bring forward quite considerably what they call their EdTech funding, which is the funding that we use to renew our IT stock in schools as a matter of course. Obviously, when we hit the pandemic, the demand for IT equipment was very, very significant, and there's been a global supply chain challenge in terms of that piece. But I'm pleased to tell members that we have 300 Chromebooks which are being built for us at the moment with the SRS and 170 other devices. So there's over 450 devices which will be rolled out to schools in the coming weeks. And as they're rolled out to schools, the older kit that the schools have can then have more Neverware put on them, and they can then be passed out to families if the need still exists. So all we keep doing is asking families to engage with their schools if they have a need for kit. We're in close contact with the schools. As I said, it was 37 as of yesterday, and we will continue to make sure that we refresh that on a regular basis.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Will.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Powell. Councillor Joe Watkins.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like just to pass on my appreciation to all the teachers and school staff who are working so hard to educate our children during this time. I know from talking to teachers how hard they are working, and it really is appreciated. So, Will, you mentioned the wonderful word synchronous learning and live lessons, as I'll call them, because yes, you're quite right. The parent community generally likes the idea of live learning. An awful lot of parents tend to feel that if our children actually see their teachers, they engage more accurately, they have that interaction, it feels more like school rather than doing it just because mum said. and there's an awful lot of benefits, as well as them actually being trained teachers who know what they're talking about, rather than me trying to remember how to do long division, which is really not one of my skill sets anymore. So could you say what percentage of our secondary and primary, I know it's going to be different, are actually doing, of our children are actually receiving live lessons at the moment? And my other question is relating to engagement. Are we as a local authority tracking the level of engagement that our pupils are actually having with their blended learning provision? I've seen some stats go out on Twitter from some of the local primary schools, so I know some of our primaries are doing it, but are we looking at that as a piece as a local authority? Thank you.
Yeah, of course. So, okay. So the first thing I would say, and I'm sure that this will be repeated by our head teacher colleagues when they're with us on Thursday, is that I think the perceived benefit of synchronous or live learning is that there is a perceived benefit to it. But in terms of pedagogical research and so on, it is not found to be of greater benefit than other means of delivering remote learning. And I think I'll just, for once, I've actually got the right quote here, actually. So this is from the Education Endowment Foundation, which is one of the kind of the principal drivers of education research in the UK. And they say pupils can learn through remote learning, ensuring the elements of effective teaching are present. For example, clear explanations, scaffolding and feedback is more important than how or when they are provided. There was no clear difference between teaching in real time, the synchronous learning, and alternatives, the asynchronous learning. For example, teachers might explain a new idea live or in a pre-recorded video. What matters most is whether the explanation builds clearly on pupils' prior learning or how pupils' understanding is subsequently assessed. So I think this is the kind of the really important line, that actually these two different approaches both have a place. And I think that it's really, you know, and I know my colleagues will say this on Thursday, that actually it's impossible to say one size fits all. So, you know, I would, from experience, say that, you know, having a child sitting in front of a laptop or something for a full day is not necessarily a good outcome in terms of learning. It doesn't promote independence and so on. But actually, some of those other points you raised, Councillor Watkins, about teacher engagement, around class engagement, are really important. But to think about how we can do that on a mixed basis is probably the way forward. So to have some tasks that are asynchronous, where people can access them at a time which is appropriate, and to have some things which are kind of important keystones for the children in terms of knowing that they're going to touch base with their teacher on a regular basis and they're going to have the opportunity to see classmates and so on, is going to be important as well. So I do think that it's not a black and white issue, and in the grey we'll find the very best practice. The other part to it is in terms of tracking engagement levels. Yeah, we're asking, you know, all of our schools will be looking to do that. Some schools seemingly have better access to some analytics in terms of Google Classroom and so on than others, and that's something which we're working with in terms of our colleagues to understand that. But certainly in terms of our expectations, in terms of reaching out to vulnerable learners and the kind of the learning population as a whole, that's something that all of our schools do. So yeah, I think one of the challenges is that inevitably people will draw comparisons between classes within a school. They'll draw comparisons between schools in an area and even schools at different parts of the authority. So there are different approaches, because in every school there'll be different approaches to pedagogy and to how learning takes place. So you'd expect to see some of that variance. But at this time, I know how difficult it is for parents to be kind of working or supporting their children. I did see somebody saying the other day, you know, how we might have learned how to do some mathematical pieces, long division or long multiplication, has changed significantly. And when I see the new routes of doing it, I'm kind of like, I don't understand that at all. But actually, you know, it is really important that we balance all of those kind of aspects. The other point is around access. And sometimes if you have, you know, potentially a family of 4 at home, or 3 or 5 or how many in that family, trying to access using broadband, there can be significant weaknesses around that. And having asynchronous resources that children can then draw on later and actually scheduling that through the day can be a benefit as well. But yeah, I think hopefully, Councillor Watkins, you'll be able to join us on Thursday, and you'll get some great insights from the heads who will be presenting that day.
Okay, thanks for that. No other members. I go to the guest, Councillor Armand Watts.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. So I waited 2 hours for Maureen to ask my question. Fantastic, thank you, Maureen. And this, strangely enough, that was a question that I was not allowed to ask full council last week, and then as if by magic, Maureen asked the question. But I'll ask it another, just because I feel I've just been in the other room. I didn't hear all of Maureen's question because I was teaching Sophia a bit of home learning Spanish. How about that? So I'm multitasking here. It hasn't all gone to waste, Chair. But it was specifically around obviously home learning, and then obviously about the words we've used: remote learning, digital inequality. You've already covered that. Thank you to Maureen's question. But it was specifically then about the routers, and you know, we've got an issue now. We'll use laptops on order. I remember a time when the local authority was awash with laptops. We couldn't give them away, could we? And now we're in a position where we do need to get those laptops out. And specifically, as you say, if you just mentioned that you made a very good case yourself. You've got 4 in a family. You know, I had problems the other night really trying to get online just to do a simple task when I realised that everybody else, with the exception of Pauline, was online. But you know, it is important that children can access those lessons, and I do worry about, you know, families who are moving around in between 1 or 2 parents maybe, or guardians that haven't got access. What provision we're putting in for them now, not waiting for it to be on order. Surely there must be some kind of emergency, effectively, provision that we can put in place. And then, I mean, I heard this argument at my son's local school yesterday, you know, about, well, we've got that issue covered, even though there's a 40% in uptake on children, as I mentioned earlier, taking free school meals. We've relied on the parents, the charity of the parents, to provide that provision. Now, we know that's fine in areas where parents can afford to do that. But, you know, for example, forgive me for saying this if my constituents are hearing, but, you know, my ward simply probably isn't in the same position. It is not. So there clearly are growing inequalities, and I wouldn't want to do about that. So sorry if it's repetitive. Thank you.
Well,
okay, thanks, Councillor. So you were breaking up a little bit then, and just you know, it kind of, it makes the point, doesn't it, in terms of the broadband piece. In terms of FSM, we have seen significant growth in FSM, and that's obviously, you know, related to the economic impact of the pandemic and so on. Obviously, we support, just as for all members to be aware, we are paying all of our members, sorry, not all of our members, any family who are entitled to free school meals are paid on a weekly basis, £3.90 a day per child. So that's all paid directly to them, and it has been since the start of the pandemic. In terms of that emergency response, so we've, you know, by the end of this week, everybody who a school has indicated needs a piece of equipment, that piece of equipment will be with them. So that's what we're working on at the moment. So they're just having that new software installed. And in terms of parental provision, that's, I think, hopefully that's the point, is that we are providing this equipment to those families where they need a piece of kit. The other point in terms of accessing learning, I think if it continued to be a challenge for a family in terms of accessibility or in terms of kit, the Minister did make her point in a Twitter Q&A, I think, after one of her recent announcements, that at some point that does become a form of vulnerability. And once that becomes a form of vulnerability, then we would be able to think about providing that place in school for that learner so that they're able to access the resources there. So you know, as all of the evidence that I've been provided, you know, suggests that the kit is being provided to those families who need it. The MiFi devices are there as well for those families as well, if that accessibility to the internet is still required. And we'll continue to do all we can to support them.
Okay, thanks, Will. Councillor Lisa Dimmock, and welcome to the committee today, Lisa.
Hi, Chair. Thank you ever so much. I've actually had connectivity problems, so sorry, Will, if I repeat what you're saying, but I've got some information that I'm happy to share with the panel, because I know that BT And EE are doing unlimited data at the moment to help with those homeschooling at no extra cost. If you want me to share that information, I know that network providers are doing, obviously, because that's my job day to day, I can share that with you, Armand, and it might be worth sharing with your residents.
Yeah, I
That
think
would be
that's
really good, Councillor.
Yeah, I think that would be very helpful. Sorry, Will.
Sorry, Chair. I know that Paul's been doing a bit of a Twitter campaign recently in terms of some of those offers were available in England and not necessarily in Wales.
Yeah.
So we've been trying to raise awareness of that. But if there's a couple there, BT and E, that would be really good to be able to share that. And
I'll
I know
share that with you.
schools, thank you, Councillor Dimmock, and schools have been really trying to make, you know, all of those kind of all of those opportunities make their families aware of those.
Okay, well, thanks. There are no other questions or comments, but thanks for that, Lisa, and that would be very helpful. Excuse me. Obviously, I'd like to thank Will for coming in at fairly short notice to give us an update, and I think it's clarified in some terms of synchronous learning and asynchronous learning. That has been helpful, and in terms of what is happening. Certainly, I think there's generally parents have certainly spoken to me, and I know other elected members, about the issue of the sort of hardware, the laptops or iPads, etc., for families who are perhaps on a challenging income, and in terms of providing that and providing for for broadband. I am heartened to hear that there is this free devices to actually allow children to access that. It is a major concern, I think, across, not just across Wales, but across the whole of the UK, and particularly in families where you have, say, 2 or 3 children or 4 children who all want to access learning at the same time. You might have parents working from home. So I think it's something we need to keep an eye on, and certainly from looking at the national press, children who are on free school meals, that is an issue in terms of, do you spend money on broadband or do you spend it on food or other essential things. But thanks very much for that. I would endorse what Councillor Joe Watkins said, certainly passing on thanks to all serving teachers and head teachers and classroom assistants who are working in very difficult circumstances, whether it's in the hub schools or whether they're teaching online. It is a very difficult time, so I'm sure the committee would want to express their thanks. Certainly I would, to those members of staff who are actually in the front line in school or online. So thanks, Will, for that. I move now to item 7 on the agenda, which is the work planner. Obviously, you've looked at budget today. The next date will be a workshop on the 28th at 2 o'clock, 28th of January, on Welsh medium education, which I will very much look forward to. Then there will be a meeting on the 11th of CYP, and we'll be looking at the EAS business plan and looking at the free meals free school meals strategy, FSM strategy. In terms of number 8, agenda number 8, we've got the Cabinet and Council work planner, which is there for information. 9, to confirm the minutes of the previous meeting, and unless anybody has anything to raise, I will take it that those minutes were an accurate representation of what happened. I certainly read them last night. I found nothing to question on that. And
can I propose they're accepted, Chair?
Oh,
can I move that they're accepted?
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Grogut. Shall I take silence as assent to that motion? Yes. That's great. Thank you, Councillor Grogut. And then lastly, item 10, to confirm the date and time of the next meeting, which is on the 11th of February, and then there is a meeting on the 9th of March 2021. Thank you all. this morning for attending, and thank you. Many thanks to all of the contributors. It's been quite a long morning. Looking at it, it's now 12:33. But thank you very much, diolch yn fawr, and I hope you can enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chair.
Cheers, Chair. Bye.